Hi everyone, welcome to this collaborative webinar between Honeycomb and New Minds. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to dive straight in, and I'm joined today by Deri from Honeycomb, my business partner, and Caroline from New Minds. And I'm Colin Mann, I'm one of the MDs of Honeycomb. I'm going to ask Deri and Caroline to introduce themselves in a second. But just before we dive into that, there's a couple of things I'd just like to do. And the first one is, for anyone online now, invite you just to introduce yourself in the comments section, and that's partly I'd love to see who's on and see some names and perhaps where you're, which organisation you're from. So you can do that in the comments space on the stream. I also just want to check our technology as well. So if I can see your comments coming through, that's great. If you have any issues with the audio or hearing me, you should be able to see myself, Deri, and Caroline, and indeed our slideware as well. So I'd invite you now just to say hello in the comments field. That would be great, into the chat. Just while you're doing that, some of you may have already downloaded our Consulting People report, and that is the focus of our webinar today. If you haven't, you can do so in a couple of different ways. You can use the QR code that's on the screen, or I'm just going to post into the chat myself, into the comments field there, a link. So if you're at your computer, that might be a little bit easier to use. And thanks, I can see a few comments coming through now. So no one has said that they can't see me or hear me. I'm gonna guess that is all okay. And you've all responded to my request there anyway, so I'm assuming you can hear me. Please do download the report. So if you haven't done already, hopefully you'll see my comment coming through. It's about midway down there, or you can use the QR code instead. And just while you're coming in and settling in and downloading that report, perhaps, and do keep introducing yourselves in the comments field, I'll just explain what we're going to do today. So obviously the focus is the Consulting People report, which Honeycomb and New Minds published just a couple of weeks ago. And so, like I say, some may have already read it, and this may be new to some of you. After introductions, Caroline's going to take us through the key insights that we have highlighted in that report. And then Deri will take you through a playbook of what we propose consulting firms do, by and large, to fall into line with those insights. One final point for me before I hand over to Deri is one around questions. We are going to leave a bit of time at the back end of this session for comments, for questions, for discussion. Please, if you have anything that you'd really like to ask, or even just a comment or thought as it occurs to you, please do put it in the comments space. I'll be keeping my eye on that and looking for difficult questions to ask Caroline and Deri at the back end, and also themes that may emerge as well. So don't wait till the end. If it occurs to you, put it into the comments field there. I'll pick it up. And then at the back end, I'll look to kind of pose those and we'll have a discussion. So I think that's enough from me, and I'm going to hand over to Deri first to introduce himself.
Thank you, Colin, and thank you, Caroline, for joining us. It's such a pleasure to be talking about the Consulting People report. This was an idea that we had maybe 9 months ago, and the genesis of it really was to answer the question of all of the change, all of the volatility, all of the conversations about hybrid and AI and intergenerational working and all of that stuff that was bubbling around. No one seemed to have any answers on what everyone else was doing. And that, like, the inspiration for this report really was to go out and try and get some answers and find out what firms are really, really doing. For those that don't know me, I'm Deri, Managing Director at Honeycomb Consulting Skills Training. And I've just got a real passion for figuring out how the people in the consulting industry are going to be impacted by all of this change, and what we can all do to help everybody thrive as we go forward. So real pleasure to be here talking to you all today. And it's been a real pleasure to see the hundreds of people who've downloaded the report and got some value from it. And I have the pleasure of sitting back and listening to Caroline talk through the first half of this before I'll come back in at the end. So Caroline, over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Deri, and thanks, Colin. So for those who don't know me, I'm Caroline Boston. I'm the Managing Director at New Minds. And at New Minds, we work with consulting firms. We only work with consulting firms, in fact. And the work that we do is really about building, retaining, and developing exceptional teams on the basis that we know that people are the engine of success within a consulting business. And as Deri said, we've seen so much change over the past year. So many new pressures that our clients in the consulting sector are facing. Pressures around tech, pressures around clients, pressures from their workforce. And I'm reading, like Deri, I guess, a lot of theory all the time. But the one thing that we always commit to do really at New Minds is to think about the kind of what's happening on the ground, the kind of practical application of people strategy. And it can be quite hard when you read the theory to understand what that means for you in your own firm. And so when Deri proposed that we collaborate on this report, I was really excited about the opportunity to dig a bit deeper, to undertake the kind of research that would enable us to understand what's actually happening, what's really changing, and help you to start to think about how you might shape your people strategy for the future. So what we wanted to do with the report was really move beyond those sort of high-level headlines and provide a bit more actionable guidance that reflects those sort of realities that you're dealing with every day. So let's move on and talk about the report. So first of all, what's in the report? Well, there are two parts, as Colin said. The first section of the report is really based on our research. So we did a huge amount of primary research and structured interviews, discussions with leaders from across the consulting sector. For which we're hugely grateful for the time that a number of businesses gave up for us, and some of you may even be on the call today, so thank you. There's also a significant amount of research looking at data reports that are available within the industry, and we combined all of that. And then the second part of our consulting people report is then the consulting people playbook, and that's the practical guide based on the research, the practical guide to the steps that you can take. And Deri's going to walk you through that briefly in a moment. So let's maybe start with what we found. And we found really, well, as Deri said, as I said, we're at a point of significant change, is what we found. That actually some of the very foundations of the consulting firm model are potentially under threat, changing client demands, changing talent expectations, and of course from technology. And I'll say now, this isn't a report about AI, but it sort of is a report about AI, because you won't be surprised to hear that it's a really key theme that's impacting, that's only set to increase. It's something that came up time and time again in the conversations that we had. But it's only one part of the story, really. There are four key themes from our findings. So what I'm going to do now is give you a preview of each of these and highlight some of the findings from the report. So the first of those we're calling the senior team tipping point. And I think AI is absolutely a core component of that. I think what's really interesting, I think, is that so much of the dialogue to date around AI has been very focused on how AI will impact juniors, that jobs at the bottom of the grade structure are likely to disappear, that tasks can increasingly be automated and undertaken by AI. But actually, I think what we really concluded from our work was that it's your senior team that are going to be most impacted by the increased use of AI. And why is that? Well, the truth is that your junior teams are of a generation that are actually digitally savvy. They're well prepared to embed these new ways of working. On this left-hand graph, we would describe Gen Zers as digital native. They've grown up in a digital world. They're well set up to adapt to using AI. And the next generation, Gen Alpha, they'll be AI native themselves. They're already using AI, in their day-to-day work, in their lives. I was telling Deri and Colin only recently that my 17-year-old daughter consults ChatGPT daily. In fact, I'm now told that the advice from ChatGPT is better than the advice that I provide, which was slightly disappointing to hear. But the truth is, we're dealing with very different generations in the workforce. What we found from our research that actually the much more important question is whether leaders, as AI immigrants in the main, are genuinely equipped to quality assure work that perhaps they don't fully understand. If Gen Z are using AI tools that we as leaders haven't mastered, how then do we guarantee quality or even the credibility of the work? And I think what we came away with was a sense that there's quite a big gap to close here. Interesting, I spoke to a junior at one of the big 4 firms the other day, and the message that they are getting as juniors from senior leaders is use more AI. But what they're also not, alongside that, not getting is much guidance. So exactly what should we be using? How should we be doing it? Why should we do that? Because I honestly don't think that that's fully understood yet. And so that becomes then quite complex as a senior leader. And when you add in on top of that, the need for leaders to scope work, to accurately price work that's now going to include the use of AI, that complexity really grows. So those are some of the real kind of critical pressures on the senior team right now. But I think we also know that those generational differences are about much more than just technology. Actually, there are different perspectives on work-life balance. There are different expectations of leaderships. The leaders, we believe, that who will get the best out of those ultra talented generations in the workforce are not going to be those who hark back and say, well, this is what the world was like when I entered the workforce. It's going to be about those who can really adapt to those new ways of working. But that will require energy, thought, to get that right, and that's not without its challenges. Now, the second theme in the report is more about the shape of the firm, and I think I'm sure everybody on this call has read all of the talk about the end of the traditional pyramid structure. That AI is really going to change that. And I think certainly, we would agree that that's one of the factors that we see impacting the future shape of the consulting firm. But actually, it's not the only factor by any stretch. What we found actually is that productivity in consulting businesses was accelerating even before AI, as you can see in the graph. So AI will now add to that. But importantly, the other key theme that is impacting the shape of firms is really around tenure. So if you sort of work on the premise that historically the pyramid structure was built on the basis that if we hire large numbers of juniors at that sort of entry level, then they will progress through the ranks on an up or out basis. Some will select in or out at certain points, and your shape naturally narrows into that pyramid. But what we're seeing is that tenures overall across firms are down. People are moving jobs much more frequently. And so it becomes much more challenging in that scenario to grow and then retain your own talent. So we need to think quite differently about how that model might evolve. And I think importantly, another factor is that we know that what clients want is more experienced experts on projects. The demand for juniors from clients has somewhat reduced, and so that's a factor at play here too. So actually what we're increasingly seeing is that that traditional pyramid structure is being replaced by, in many cases, more of a diamond. Actually, that's how many boutique firms have operated for some time. But I think interestingly, we're also seeing more and more firms start to think about implementing more of a kind of pod structure. And I know Deri's going to show some examples of this as we go on later. But by a pod structure, really, I mean a pod of individuals that would incorporate then SMEs, technical specialists, alongside more consulting roles in this kind of agile team structure that then can deliver maximum impact for clients. That's something that we've seen more and more. Things are changing very rapidly, but it feels like a point of flux right now when we think about the shape of firms. But I think that changing shape of firm is then only half the story. So the other critical challenge that we saw very much through the conversations that we had as we were conducting the research is, well, how do we now enable these new teams to work effectively, to stay connected, to maintain our culture, particularly when we're not all in the same place. And I think that's our next major shift. We've called it hybrid by design. And hybrid working isn't new. It started really as a reaction to the pandemic. Now it's a key element in how we think about the organisation of our teams. We know that now nearly 40% of consultants are based outside of London. In fact, we've seen at New Minds, a number of clients that we work with now kind of tapping into local talent, setting up regional hubs in different cities outside of London. And of course, it can also be a way to access then potentially lower cost talent. So, this hybrid working feels like this sort of huge opportunity. But I think equally what we found and certainly came across from the people we spoke with is that hybrid comes with a huge number of challenges. So we've identified in the report 4 key risk areas that are going to need very deliberate design when you're thinking about your model. So those are around relationships, culture, learning, and well-being. And I think interestingly on that latter point in particular, well-being is a really interesting and complex topic. We heard so much, I think, about the positive impact for people of being able to work from home, commute, reduce that commuting time, and have overall a better work-life balance. But I think we're also seeing some negative impacts, of doing most of our work via Teams calls. There's some physical and mental impact on individuals that potentially is now linked to some of the increased well-being challenges that we're seeing across teams. And so real thought needs to go into the design there. And as hybrid models become the norm, we're definitely seeing rising stress, burnout, and linked to that, I guess, a risk of losing that kind of informal learning and connection that actually once really defined consulting culture. So I think this makes it even more important to invest in that sort of human side of consulting and to develop capabilities that will help us navigate this kind of complexity to support clients and teams. And so that brings me very neatly onto our 4th theme, the final topic from our research. And I think, I said to Deri, this is the one that sort of really fills me with most optimism. And we've called this The Future is Human, because I think, what came across really strongly in our interviews, in our research, is that there is a need to adapt to a new AI world, to upskill and to embed new ways of working, undoubtedly. But equally, that it's the human skills that make a great consultant that will become more rather than less important. That actually, and it's the communication, the relationships, the empathy that are going to matter to clients. And they're the things that are definitely the most difficult to codify. So actually, what we're concluding from our research is that the firms and the individuals that are really going to distinguish themselves in future will be those that can get this bit right. And if I kind of link that to the very first theme that I mentioned about that senior leader tipping point, these are also, these human skills are the skills that make a really great leader, that will bring out the best in teams, will actually navigate that hybrid world with empathy, and of course, be the advisor that clients need. And so that feels like a very kind of hopeful finding, I think, from our research. And so, we find ourselves right now, at this sort of point of change. And my question, I suppose, to you is, how will we respond to this? How will we respond as leaders in particular? And so this is the perfect moment, I think, to hand over to Deri. He's going to walk us through the consulting playbook and some of those practical ways that we can perhaps get ahead of the curve.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Caroline. Brilliantly led through a whole complex and deep set of insights that we gathered through this report. I'm going to talk through the Consulting People Playbook for the next 15 minutes or so. Please do put your questions in, because we're going to have about 20 minutes at the end of this for Q&A and discussion, and this is your opportunity to get your questions answered. So no, I'm sure that the stuff that Caroline covered has triggered a whole bunch of thoughts and questions for all of you, or just comments, like anything that you that comes to mind. Please do put them in the chat wherever you're watching this. I know we have had some problems with the LinkedIn Live link, but hopefully Some of you have found your way through to StreamYard as well. Yeah, pop your questions in and we will get those answered either as we go or at the end. So thank you very much, Caroline. I'm going to start to talk through the 5-point Consulting People playbook. So as we were reviewing all of those bits that that led to the 4 pillars of insights of the People report, we were then thinking, this isn't going to be helpful to people unless we can say, what should you do as a result of all of this change that's happening? And these are the 5 building blocks that we believe are critical for consulting firm leaders, people leaders, and consulting teams as you head through 2026. And they don't directly reflect the insights because they meld them together in ways that are practical and useful. So the first one is to stay client and strategy led. And this is pretty timeless, but the firms that we spoke to that were most effectively navigating this time had a real laser focus on what is going to be valuable to our clients. Who are we trying to serve? What problems are we trying to solve for them? And how can we be valuable to them? So they weren't starting from how can we use AI or how can we access other people. Everything that they were starting from was what's going to be valuable to clients. And I just want to put that front and center of the thought process here. You don't have a consulting firm if you don't have clients that are going to pay you to solve problems for them. And that obviously needs to lead into your strategy as well. And the strategy needs to include not just your commercial strategy, but your people strategy, your learning strategy, your recruitment plans. All of that needs to be fully oriented through to the ways that you're going to be differentiated in the eyes of your target clients and keep promises to them. So that's foundational. The second point here, operationalize culture. A lot of what we're talking about is having a big impact on the way that firms work together. So you've got the shift to hybrid working, the generational differences, the impact of new tools, new ways of working with everybody, and also just the stress that a lot of people are under, the complexity of these times that we're living in. And what we mean by operationalized culture is to think very consciously about the culture that you want to create and make sure that you embed that into the processes that you run every day. So if you've got a distributed team, what are your locked in weekly, monthly, quarterly cadences that ensure that that team has opportunity to talk to each other and connect with each other? And I'm going to talk a little bit later about some ways of making sure in particular that junior and senior folks are interacting with each other. So deliberately and consciously designing for your culture and putting that in place from a process perspective is critical as we try and navigate through these times. Point 3 is to lead on expertise and quality. So one of the big things that we saw is the increasing need and demand from clients for deep expertise. Expertise in the industry, expertise in the problem that you're solving. Matters more than brand, matters more than the idea that you've done this thing lots of times or you've got good relationships, etc. More and more they want somebody that really understands their business. So you've got to accelerate that time to expertise for the people in your team. And you've also got to ensure that your quality is on point. And this is a particular pinch point when it comes to using AI. And one of the reasons that the senior team tipping point is an important theme is because that QA process for AI generated outputs or AI supported outputs is much more difficult and complex than the QA process has been before. And I'm going to come back to that point with the practical guidance I'm going to give at the end of this little section. Upgrade human skills, really dear to my heart, this one, and really speaks to that final point that Caroline was making about the future being human. The difficulty, complexity, stress, uncertainty, everything that we're all living through at the moment on many different dimensions really just brings to the heart of it the need for those human skills of curiosity, of empathy, of vulnerability, the ability to listen and ask questions and genuinely try and understand what the person sitting opposite you needs from you and how you can help them. And that person could be a colleague or it could be a client. And more we're seeing firms coming to us as a training business and saying, our team are technically brilliant and they can deliver fantastic results for clients, but we really need them to be able to develop more human level relationships. How can we help with that? How can we drive that? And it's just a theme we're seeing all over the place at the moment. And if you can be standing shoulder to shoulder with your clients as they go through this this challenging time, that's going to pay dividends for all of your life experiences as well as your commercial success as a firm. And then the final point, automate and experiment. This is not a report about AI, as Caroline said, but you cannot deny the importance of AI as a tool that's having a huge impact on the consulting industry. And what we have broadly seen is that most firms are in the domain of experimentation at the moment. And they're experimenting with a bit of automation. They're experimenting with a bit of AI. They're generally deploying some of these tools in ad hoc, individual use cases, individual tasks, individual people. And what we are encouraging people to do in 2026 is essentially get off the fence, stop the experimenting, and start to put some stuff in place, but still with a mind of testing what works, still with a mind of seeing what's going to deliver you value. And we think there's 3 different levels to that are the safest way to access this. So first is using AI tools to drive efficiency and effectiveness within your existing workflows, and doing that in a way that is starting to embed them into those workflows, getting beyond the ad hoc use of ChatGPT, the ad hoc use of Copilot to solve a problem, into actually embedding them into your workflows in a more automated way. The second level is an enabler of that time to expertise piece, and making sure that you're using AI as a way of codifying your knowledge and also upskilling your team on that knowledge and expertise so that they can get to expert status faster. And the third level is then to think about new client value propositions that might come off the back of AI capabilities. But I wouldn't start there, because that's a much more difficult problem to solve. And you can get a huge amount of benefit if you're in those first 2 buckets to start with. Colin at the end is going to mention some AI for consulting training that we're running in a couple of months' time that will help you get a little head start on that as well. So those are the 5 points in our Consulting People Playbook, and you can read the report and get a little bit of detail in them. But what I wanted to do in the next 10 minutes or so was just bring it to life in a way that joins some of the dots and give you some real practical advice there. So one of the insights we had was around the end of the pyramid. And what we mean by the end of the pyramid is that some firms are starting to realize that the traditional pyramid shape of a consulting team, with lots of juniors doing a lot of the grinding work to research, analyze, etc., is starting to shift. AI can do some of those activities now, and it's going to be able to do more in the future. And we've got, if you've read the report, you'll recognize this diagram of shifting from a typical team structure to a pod or a diamond structure. Now, I should just emphasize that we don't have many examples of many firms that have wholeheartedly gone to this model yet. The cutting edge firms are experimenting with it in certain domains of consulting. So if you're not there yet, don't worry, you're not miles behind, but things are starting to move in that direction. The main differences between these 2 structures are in the typical team, you'll have a partner, or maybe levels of partners in a bigger firm, of senior partners through to more junior partners. And you'll have a manager who's at the center of everything. If any of you played that manager role, it's a pretty hard place to be. And you're managing the team, you're owning the recommendations, and then you've got a team of consultants and analysts underneath you, and you might call in some subject matter experts in various domains, whether they're internal to your firm or they're external, to help make sure you're cracking the problems effectively. Under the pod or diamond structure, one of the models that people are experimenting with is on the right of this. So you've still got that senior partner, but they need to think about selling, scoping, pricing in different ways than they have before. They need to be thinking about QA in different ways than before. The importance of the subject matter experts gets elevated as part of that QA process, but also in response to client demand. And then alongside the manager, you've got a set of architects who are the ones that are developing agents, developing the automations, really running the tech backbone. And the consultant, the junior role, changes quite a bit. So rather than doing a load of research themselves, they're managing a lot of that through agents. They're still owning the answer, but they're also having to go through additional steps of verification in different ways than they did before, which is a new skill for them. And there's also this point around replicating other people's outputs, which I'll come back to, because I think a lot of firms are missing that at the moment. So what the question that seems to throw up for a lot of people is, firstly, what does that junior role look like in the future? And secondly, if I don't have many juniors, who are my managers going to be in the future? Who are my partners going to be in the future? How are we going to develop people through? And I think that question is a very valid question and is really true. But I also think people are slightly misunderstanding what the future junior role might be. And they're missing a couple of areas of real value that those junior roles can bring to the firm today, that I think it's really important to bear in mind. So I just want to dive into that a little bit over the last little section here. I'm just going to pause because you've got about 5 minutes until we're going to audience Q&A. So get your questions in. We've had a few questions coming in. We're going to go through them in order. So the faster you get them in, the more likely you are to get your question answered. So if we take this pod diamond structure, firstly, just to dive into two specific areas here. So on the bottom left here, we've got this AI enhanced consultant, and that what we really expect to see with these people is a shift through this year and into next year from using ad hoc tools, using their own instance of ChatGPT or Enterprise Copilot just to ask some questions, run some prompts, check some outputs, do a bit of research, to actually having those more embedded into AI workflows, and that being enabled by someone else in the firm who's building some of those workflows. Or if you've got tech savvy juniors, building them themselves. And I'm going to come back to that tech savviness in a second. And then for the partners, one of the big stretches that many are going to see is this ability to QA outputs. We've all seen headlines of firms as big as Deloitte and big law firms producing outputs that were AI generated that were just flat out wrong, hallucinations, not properly verified, not properly replicated. And that is a failure of their QA process as they're producing those outputs. And that responsibility absolutely sits with the senior people in your firm who are presenting those things out to clients. And it's a stretch for people. It's no longer enough to say, can I look at the model, the Excel model, and validate that you've got the right checks built into the model. It's no longer enough to triangulate sources. You need a really rigorous process to think about that QA process. And so what we think in that is that in the report, you may, if you've seen it, you've seen this set of activities to drive that QA process. And there's one piece around QA tiers and deciding what level of QA is appropriate. Absolutely important. There's one piece around verification, and that's essential. You're probably thinking about that already. You're probably already aware that verification is a necessary step. The bit that I don't see any people talking about at the moment, and it impacts the future size and shape of your pyramid or your pod or your diamond, whatever structure you end up in, how many juniors you need in the future, is this piece around replication. And that's a critical step. So one of the features of AI models is that you don't necessarily get the same outputs for the same inputs, which is not true of most of our traditional analytical tools. You put the same inputs in, you get the same inputs out in an Excel model. In AI tools and Gen AI tools, that's not the case. So that replication step creates more work, but is a necessary part of the QA process and requires additional junior resource. And I think that's a bit that people are missing when they're planning forwards as to how many people they're actually going to need in the future. So that's one way that I think juniors are more valuable now than we think. But the bigger way is what we call the two-way learning model. And I think there's a real opportunity here for forward-thinking firms to differentiate in not just the value they get from juniors, but the value they can offer to juniors, how they can empower them, and how they can build a strong culture. So we've heard about a number of different themes that are emerging. We've got the impact of AI and the fastest tech adoption of all time by a long way. Faster than the mobile phone, faster than the internet, faster than crypto. The AI tech adoption is the fastest of all time. we've got a generational shift that is huge. And Caroline showed that chart earlier, where in just a few years' time, 50% of the workforce will be Gen Z or Gen Alpha, who have grown up absolutely digitally and AI savvy. When Caroline's 17-year-old daughter is in the workforce, she's going to know AI tools much better than the 50-plus-year-old partners who might be advising her if she's lucky enough to get into a consulting career. And you've got hybrid working and those cultural aspects as well. And what we see as a really powerful opportunity here is to encourage the senior team, not just to pass knowledge on to the junior team, but to learn from them, to learn about AI and tech, learn about how Gen Z see the world. If you've got clients who are serving Gen Z or Gen Alpha customers, and you're producing recommendations and outputs to them that you're not asking your junior team to sense check with a Gen Z hat on, then you're missing a trick. And so this is a real opportunity, but the enabler of this opportunity comes from the attitude of your senior team. They must approach this with curiosity and a willingness to learn. So just a really practical way of doing this is if you run regular lunch and learns, for example, have someone really junior in your team run a lunch and learn on a topic that they're expert in. It could be a tech topic. It could be talking about what Gen Z cares about. It could be sharing how their generation use Snapchat or X or some social platform that your partners have never heard of. Whatever is their area of expertise, get them to share that. But the critical thing is that your senior team turn up with curiosity. And one of the real pinch points that we see in the generational challenge here is that the senior teams are often a bit scathing of how the junior team want to live and work and what they prioritize. And they don't agree with the values that their junior staff are bringing into the workplace. And I see a lot of a lack of a curiosity around that. So this is, again, one of these reasons why the senior team tipping point is such a big theme. If the senior team are curious and if they're asking questions and they really want to learn what's going on for their juniors, the juniors feel empowered and you really build that one team culture. And this is a core part of operationalizing culture like that. So I would really recommend that you sit down and think about what is the value of our junior team now and in the future when you're starting to think about where is this going to take us? How does this pull us through into the future model that we need and the future talent pipelines that we need? I will pause there and bring Colin and Caroline back on so that we can get some questions. If you haven't yet had chance to download the report, this QR code will take you to a space to download the Consulting People report. And I will hand over to Colin to see what questions we've got.
Awesome. Thanks, Caroline. Thanks, Deri. So we do have a couple of good ones here, and I think there's some challenging ones. I'm going to start with one from Nick, and thanks everyone for your questions. If I read this out quickly, and then I'll get both your views on it. I think this is very relevant. So Nick is asking, there's a comment first and then a question, but given the pace of development of LLMs, it feels like the major challenge is to envisage the role that AI will play in delivering advice over 1, 3, or 5 years across professional services, and then test your people and organizational strategy against this. And it feels like there's a major disconnect coming. And I think Nick would appreciate your views on that. And interestingly, I think when we launched the report a couple of weeks ago, one of the consulting firm leaders there actually was living that disconnect straight away. And they were acknowledging that their staffing model that they currently are living with is based on a recruitment model that's 2 years old because of the time it takes for them to source and find particularly junior entrants, and therefore the staff that they have today actually no longer matches the way they're trying to deliver work. So, and that was a good example of the disconnect happening, not necessarily coming. But Deri, Caroline, any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. It's definitely a challenging time to forecast anything. I follow a bunch of people who try and live a few years in the future, and the general consensus seems to be that people don't necessarily know what the world might look like even in 2030. And so it is very difficult to plan that far ahead and think about the people that you need. I think it comes back to any strategy is not a rigid roadmap. It needs to be a flexible model. And the amount of flexibility that you're able to bring into your people strategy such that you can adapt and change as you go is going to be super critical. Caroline, I don't know if you've got a different view.
No, I would agree, and I think the conversations that we're having with clients right now exactly about this are about, you know, how do you build that level of agility into your strategy and into your workforce planning in particular, such that you are able to react at reasonable pace as things are changing. And so what are the inputs that you have that inform some of those workforce planning decisions? When do you need to make them? How can you really keep on top of the data that then is informing what are the skills that we need in our team? You know, what is the firm going to look like as the current team evolve and grow and develop through the organization? And how do we put all those pieces of information together and take decisions at reasonable pace based on things that we know to be true, but recognizing, you're right, you know, we don't know what the world's going to look like in 2030. And I think if we were to set too much store by kind of creating a desired state to get to without building in that agility, the chances are, you know, what we're predicting will be wrong.
Yeah, agree. And I think practically what that means is one, get really close to clients. So you're walking step by step with them and understanding what is coming for them down the line. 2, this is one of the reasons why we talk about this time to expertise and time to knowledge accelerating. So as the world moves and as your propositions move and your delivery models move, your ability to get somebody up to speed with how to solve problems for clients in that new domain is a competitive differentiator. And that is enabled by the skill of unlearning and relearning, which is increasingly important as well. And that's really, again, one of the things that's really difficult for the senior team in particular is to let go of some of the paradigms that have guided their advice to people in the way that they work and the way they run the businesses for a long time, because some of them aren't true anymore. And so you've got this, if the practical way of stepping through that is to build in flexibility by staying close to clients, by accelerating your ability to get people up to speed quickly and developing that unlearn and relearn skill.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think there's a sort of practical piece about really looking at your future sales pipeline and seeing what's emerging in terms of themes, you know, the type of work that clients seem to be wanting to buy. What does that mean in terms of the shape of the team that would be needed to deliver it, the kind of skills, and not necessarily holding on to your old views of this is the shape that we're managing our workforce to, this is how we plan our resourcing and our recruitment, but actually where we have got any data points about what the future's likely to look like, how can we make sure that we're drawing upon that and really looking at it all the time as to how that's evolving?
There's a nice segue in there. I'm going to move us on now. Keith's put a few comments in here. Keith, thanks for those. Not so much questions, but comments, but I'm going to blend a couple of them. And then I think there is a question implied in there. So earlier on, Keith put a comment in there that consulting has always been about humans and will always be. And I certainly agree with that. And then later down, there's a comment about differentiation, essentially. So there's a need to really drive that, drive differentiation through, precise value propositions, which may or may not be augmented with AI. Certainly something that we've seen at Honeycomb over the particularly last 6 months to a year now, has been that our clients have understood that the human factor is a huge differentiator for them, and increasingly so. So whereas we've always provided training on human interaction and building trust has been central to the majority of training that we do, we're now seeing a real demand for those skills to be really heightened. So to meet that holy grail of becoming a trusted advisor is going to be one of the areas in which consulting firms start to differentiate. And I think it's linked to the need for, again, increasing numbers of more experienced SMEs from industry as well. We've mentioned differentiation a couple of times, but any more thoughts, Deri, Caroline, on how people can look to do that in the future?
I mean, it's certainly first of all, I agree, and I think the data that we're seeing, so the research, for example, done recently by Source Global shows that that's what clients want. What clients want is consultants that really understand their problems, and that's really at the intersection of kind of industry sector and then capability. How do those two things come together to really understand and empathize with client challenges? And if you can position yourself at that intersection that feels really relevant to your clients, then that differentiation as a proposition will be really appealing. So then the challenge is, well, how do we make sure that that's what we've got in terms of the skill sets of the individuals within our organization, and typically why we would frame that as the client's problem, not their desire to have somebody who specifically just knows their sector or specifically can do a specific thing in terms of capability. Part of that is about that empathy, which is the human skill, and then the ability to help somebody navigate through the change as they deal with that problem. So yes, totally agree. I suppose I would say in terms of the need to differentiate. Deri?
Yeah, I mean, I love this comment. It's one of those things that is foundationally true, but increasingly important. And it's one of the reasons that we had stay client and strategy led as the first part of our playbook, because I mean, for many years now, I've said, if you're developing a competency framework, for example, you're trying to define the capabilities that you need as a business. The two most important dimensions to think about are, what are the set of things that give clients a reason to choose you, which is differentiation, and what are the set of things that enable you to keep your promises to them. That's just got more and more important because of this importance of expertise point that you make, Caroline. And similarly within that, what we're seeing is the firms that are winning are the ones that are narrower and narrower in terms of their focus in their area of expertise. And that not just the intersection of kind of industry and problem, but sub-problem and sub-problem. And their ability to go in and say, we know exactly how to solve this thing. And AI, I think, is an enabler of that, because you can have multiple points of deep expertise. What's not good enough anymore is just to say, oh, we've got smart people who solve problems. And most firms have got past that, but they still tend to say, we've got smart people who worked in retail, so we can solve retail problems. And they need to get much, much narrower and much more focused in that, in my view.
Okay, I'm going to ask you another tough one now, which has come in from Shakti. Again, thank you for your questions and comments. I won't read the whole one out here, but there's a comment noting that she's got experience, I think, in working in different types of firms here. But it's something that we've talked about before. If we think the pyramid model is going to erode and maybe move towards more of a house or a diamond, how can we replicate learning by doing for juniors when AI does 80% of the doing? And certainly, for people, let's say my generation and yours, Dave, I think we certainly learned by doing, and therefore when we reached that very difficult position of manager, as you called it, which named differently in different firms, but when we are leading the delivery of an engagement, we have relied very, very heavily on the experiences of doing as a junior to allow us to apply QA and understand how rigorous something is and how complete something is, for us to perceive the work that has to be done and how long that might take, and the challenges of that. So I think this is a really tough question, and so I'm going to pose it to you, Deri, Caroline. How do we replicate learning by doing for juniors?
Are we not saying that the doing is different? That actually the doing we need to learn to do. So the hardest role now, I think, is going to be for the managers and senior leaders who have people doing things that they were not previously doing. But actually, the doing overall, in terms of how consulting work is done, will be different in future. And so actually, those who progress through the organization, where they're working in the way exactly as Deri was describing, where actually the use of AI is embedded in their work, but what that needs is a level of curiosity, challenge, and QA to understand those outputs, combined with those human skills as to how do we actually dial that bit up to be more and more relevant to clients. That's the new doing model, and you're still you'll be learning that, but in a different way. I don't know. What do you think, Deri?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the phrase that comes to mind is good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment. And doing the doing, even as a junior consultant, is essentially about developing judgment. And just because you've read the reports in the past and built the model in the past and even done interviews and focus groups yourself, and in the future AI will do most of those things and you'll get a summary, you're still going to be responsible for a story and a set of slides and a conversation with a client that has to hang together, make sense, and be practically applicable. And many of the ways that I learn, and I could picture some specific awkward workshops where I exercised poor judgment in what I put on a slide in a room full of senior clients and got torn to shreds. And that was an experience that enabled me to develop better judgment around it. And I think those experiences will still happen. As long as we've still got a human consultant advising a human client, then the way that you get to the answer is just, it's a different way of doing it. And if you think back in the 80s, people were consulting without computers, and they were making slides on acetate to show on an overhead projector. I mean, when people started at Bain in the 80s, even into the 90s, they were given a pencil case with pieces of colored acetate and a protractor and a scalpel to create beautiful colored slides. The methods have changed, but the fundamental human judgment that's required has not.
Yeah. Well, look, maybe just to wrap this one up, I do think that we've mentioned it a couple of times, the senior role, whether it's in that manager position, not necessarily firm leaders, but delivery leaders, is going to be an incredibly demanding role. I think it always was. We're seeing an increasing trend in people coming from industry without consulting experience into that role. Now the demand is that they have to be even better than they used to be. They have to be brilliant now at the trust building and the human connection piece, because it's a key differentiator. The teams that they're leading are now hybrids of individuals and agents, and they may have limited experience of doing the do in the new way, as Caroline's describing. So I think there is another tough question, which we may just have time just to get a couple of thoughts on, around how do we best support people in that position? What are they going to need? I think the two-way mentoring model that Deri mentioned and had the graphic there for is a really key part of that. But any other kind of final thoughts on that from you guys? How do we support that, I guess, that community of managers and leaders?
I think the most important thing for me is just for people to recognize and voice that is a really challenging role, really challenging place to be, and be empathetic to the intensity of the learning journey that is. And that's always been true. I think it's just going to get even tougher. And where it goes wrong is when firms as particularly senior folks who maybe forgotten what it was like going through that, or they just view it as a rite of passage and they expect people just to like toughen up and get through it. That empathy and curiosity and support for those people is really important.
Couldn't have put it better myself. 100%.
Okay. Well, look, with just a few minutes to go now, obviously, as Caroline said at the start, and I think Deri did as well, this report, the Consulting People report, is not a report about AI, but of course it is the big trend that came through from the report. We obviously discussed it at length in every interview that we did to support the CPR. And certainly even leading up to the CPR work itself, increasingly we were receiving questions and demand from our consulting firm clients about support for their teams and understanding AI and training in AI for consulting. We have for some time been introducing AI applications to our normal transitional-based training from Honeycomb. But to satisfy that demand, we are developing a couple of specific AI for consulting single-day programs. We'll be running the first ones as a pilot quite soon, either in April or May this year. The dates are to TBC, and you can see from this slide here, this is our last slide. We're looking at two different components of that. One is aimed at that junior to mid-level, very much hands-on applications of AI in common and key use cases for consulting. And on the right-hand side there, more the mid to senior level, the business leader and perhaps initiative leaders in firms who really want to understand how do we drive value from it, how do we change our organization, how do we go about that, the different ways of doing that, the risks associated with that, and anything we need to understand there. If you'd like to know a little bit more about that, again, there is a QR code there just to allow you to register early interest, really. We expect quite high demand for this. We'll be running it as an open cohort in London. So if you'd like early access to tickets when they're available, or just to know a bit more about it as we expand these agendas, you can scan the QR code, and I will drop in, again, a link into the comments field there if you'd rather use your computer to take you straight there, and you can just register your interest if you want to hear a little bit more about it. And thanks, Keith, for your comments on that. I'll certainly have a little think about that one as well. And I think finally, please do connect with us. There's a link to connect directly with Caroline on the left there. The QR code on the right will take you to lots more information and resources from Honeycomb. We publish a lot of information on there. We have more webinars coming up, and we'd love you to connect with us on LinkedIn as well. You can book time directly with us as well and we'd love to hear from you and have more of a conversation. With a couple of minutes to go, Deri, Caroline, any final words from yourselves?
Really, just from me, like, it was such a pleasure pulling this whole report together and getting the excuse to dive into loads of research, and we're definitely standing on the shoulders of many others in terms of the analysis, research, commentary, thinking that has been done. So Caroline mentioned the slide at the start of all the people that we've taken insight from as a result of this, and it's just been a real pleasure. It's great to have some clarity now on what people and firms are actually doing, and we'd love to share that with you in more ways. So if you read the report and you've got questions and you want to discuss, then very happy to discuss anytime. Thank you all for joining us today. Yeah. Caroline, what about you?
No, well, agreed. Thank you first for joining. Thank you, Deri and Colin. It's been a great opportunity to collaborate, I think, on this and bring together our different areas of interest and expertise. And this is changing all the time. Some of the firms that we spoke to in October when we were doing some of the research are already doing new and interesting things. And so, our work is to now stay abreast of that. And I think, hopefully come mid-year, we'll be able to reflect back on some of these themes and see how we're starting to see things emerge. So more to follow.
And
we should say, sorry, Colin, we should say Caroline and I are running a session exclusively for Consultancy Growth Network members on the 25th of February as well, where Mark Janssen from the CGN will be interviewing us on some of this stuff, and we'll be presenting some more insights, particularly around the AI side of things. So if you're a Consultancy Growth Network member, then please do join us on that. And if you're not, join the network and then join us on that.
I think that's a great place to end. Thank you, Deri. Thanks, Caroline. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Thanks for the comments and the questions. Really appreciate that engagement, and hope to see you at a future webinar. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.